Welcome back. We are now going to discuss Iris Marion Young's article on the 5 faces of oppression. To start with a nice little quote from her, oppression refers to the vast and deep injustices that some groups suffer as a consequence of often unconscious assumptions and reactions of well-meaning people in ordinary interactions, media and cultural stereotypes, and structural features of bureaucratic hierarchies and market mechanisms. Some historical context: she was alive from 1949 to 2006. She received her PhD in philosophy from Pennsylvania. She was a prolific political and feminist philosopher. She was famous for her book, for mostly her feminist political philosophy, but also on her book, probably most famous, is on female bodily experience, Throwing Like a Girl, and other essays. Throwing Like a Girl is probably one of her most famous essays. She wrote extensively on the politics of difference and democracy. She did some good work on deliberative democracy as well. For her, oppression is going to be a structural concept. So this is kind of what she means by it. In historical usage, it really has implied colonialism and conquest. So the outline of a traditional notion of oppression is that there's some tyranny exercised by a ruling group, usually by a foreign entity, so maybe communists or fascists. There's brutality of a few over many, and then there's a lack of identification with the tyrannical, and this is exercised by the other. The outline of post-1960s usage, this is the vision that she captures with her 5 faces, is that it designates the disadvantage and injustice that some people suffer due to everyday practices. It's a systematic constraint on groups, or a series of constraints on groups. It's embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, symbols, and assumptions underlying institutional rules. So there's a kind of, this is what she means by the structural concept. It's systematic, it's institutional. It can't simply be removed by removing one oppressor or one regime. The oppressed don't necessarily have to have some corresponding oppressive group. There could just be a privileged group. If we look back at Foucault, we have to look beyond the traditional view of power as a top-down phenomenon and look instead at the exercise of power as an effective education, bureaucratic administration, production, and the distribution of consumer goods, medicine, and so on. So we shouldn't think of power being enforced just necessarily top-down. While that's certainly one conception of oppression, it's not exhaustive. And to outline the kind of post-1960s usage, we need to think a little bit more deeply about what we mean by that. So seeing that group differences cut across from each other, this is the notion of intersectionality, that each group is not oppressed in the same way, and that privileges and oppression are offered differently, we must look to a plural definition or theory. So she advances her 5 faces of oppression, and this is supposed to be not any one of them is exhaustive, and you don't need to have one of them, or sorry, more than one of them to count as oppression. Any one of these can count as oppression. So Young's goal here is to systematize the meaning of the concept of oppression as used by diverse political movements, particularly post the 1960s, to create a normative argument to clarify the wrongs that the term oppression names. And normative saying that this is something that we ought not to do. All oppressed groups face oppression, but not the same kind of oppression. Therefore, it's not possible, or not even preferable, to try to establish one essential definition that all have in common. So the following categories are sufficient. That is, if you have one of them, then it's sufficient to describe a type of oppression experienced by that group. So we have exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. And we'll go through those in turn. So on the notion of exploitation, a very common or familiar conception of exploitation is class, but we can also think of exploitation in terms of race and gender. On the condition of class, probably the most famous notion of exploitation comes from Marxism. So the idea here is that workers freely contract with employers and they receive a wage. That's considered voluntary. Everyone is, quote, formally free. So then the question is, how are there still class distinctions between those who are wealthy, those who own the means of production, and then those who work for them? On the Marxist model, profit is the basis of capitalist power and wealth. This is actually true not just on the Marxist model, but on other economic models. For labor theories of value, we can dispel the mystery of profit. So every commodity's value is ultimately the function of the labor that's necessary for its production. And that labor power produces new value. So you'll recall that John Locke has a labor theory of power. So does Marx has a labor theory of power. And the idea is that the value of a good is really just the labor that's put into that good. At least in the context of the Marxist theory, that's where the profit is found. Because the idea is that whenever you produce a commodity, you've already paid for the raw goods. And then the thing that you sell on the market for profit is the labor that people have put into it to make it. And so that the surplus value of a commodity is found in the actual labor that it takes to produce. And so that means that for a capitalist to acquire profit, they need to pay their workers less than the value of the work that they produced. So profit comes from the difference between the value of the labor performed by the worker and the value of the capacity to labor. So an employer says, I'm going to buy your labor power. That is, I'm going to buy all the labor you can do in a set period of time. And the idea is that you're producing a lot of labor in that period of time if you're a productive worker, and you get paid a set wage. You don't get paid according to how much you work. And then the capitalist sells that commodity out in the market for a relatively high price, but that commodity actually, the value, the sale price is going to reflect all of the labor that was put into it. So you've sold your labor power and you've produced labor in that time, but you don't get the full value of that labor. You're only getting paid for the use of your labor power. It's kind of like if someone were to rent a machine. I'm going to rent this machine. I'm going to drive it into the ground and produce as much as I can so that I can maximize the profit that I get off of me renting it. So profit's really only possible because the owner of the capital appropriates any realized surplus value. So capitalism, through private ownership of the means of production and through markets that allocate labor and the ability to buy goods, it systematically transfers the powers of some persons, laborers, allowing the beneficiaries to acquire more power, that being the capitalists. So workers suffer material deprivation and loss of control, and are thus deprived important sources of self-respect. Thus, as a method that allows individuals to develop their capacities to enhance their similar development and use in others must be formed. So the central insight here is that oppression occurs through a steady process of the transfer of the results of one social group to the benefit of the other. One question is, does Marx's focus on class ignore exploitation of others due to race and gender? So the idea here is, imagine we have a Marxist utopia, and we've eradicated all class distinctions. So the proletariat has risen up, they've acquired the means of production, they are owners of the means of production, and they get the full value of their labor. The question is, does this fix exploitation in other ways? Or could there still be exploitation without class? And you'll see that this is a common, especially amongst the left, there's this kind of common refrain between people that maybe support socialist policies. They say, look, the real issue in the United States, or the real political struggle, is the one between the wealthy and the poor. And if we only end that struggle, then we'll be in good shape. There will be no more oppression. But others suggest, no. There's other ways that you can exploit people. You can exploit people by virtue of their race, or you can exploit people by virtue of their gender. Just because you solve the issue of class does not mean you solve the issue of gender oppression or racial oppression. So in the context of gender, there are two aspects. There's the transfer of the fruits of material labor from women to men, and then there's the transfer of nurturing and sexual energies from women to men. We could actually even expand this and talk about non-binary genders as well. But in a patriarchal system, the point is that all the products of, or many of the products in maybe certain domains, are going to be transferred from maybe non-binary folk and women to men. And same for the nurturing and sexual energies to men. Marriage can be a class relation in which, so we're going to focus on women here because that's what she focuses on, but marriage can be a class relation in which women's labor benefits men without comparable remuneration, not only by the kind of labor, but by the very fact that it is labor given to another on whom one depends. So this is particularly true in historical contexts of marriage, or even patriarchal ideals of marriage, where a woman is dependent on a man, and like heterosexual relationships, a woman is dependent on a man, and that's going to constrain the kinds of options that are available to her. As well, she's going to offer or be compelled to give certain kinds of feminine coded goods. And we'll pick this back up when we talk about Kate Mann's work. The second point, women provide men with emotional and sexual care, generally with little remuneration. So norms of heterosexuality are generally organized around male desire as opposed to women's desires, right? So just engaging in sexual intercourse, for example, it's usually done when, say, the man is, quote, done, whereas women are generally considered not the ones, the drivers of the sexual act, for example. There's a really good, actually, Netflix explained, given by Vox on Netflix about, I think it's about orgasming, or it's about women orgasming, but it's very interesting. It does repeat or shows some stats that are similar to this point, so it's worth looking at. So outside of the home, women have become more dependent on the state for aid in raising children, and this is sometimes considered public patriarchy. Typical feminine jobs are gender-based, so they're nurturing, they're about sexual labor for sex work, they're about caring for other people's bodies, generally in counseling, in teaching. These jobs typically enhance the status, pleasure, or comfort of others, not usually women, but are used by, say, men to increase their status or meet certain desires that they have, to help them be productive in other aspects of the workforce. So another area in which exploitation can happen is through race. So menial labor is generally set aside for Latinx folk or Black Americans. Servers, for example, tend to benefit the served. So bussers, dishwashers, bell persons, chamber persons, nannies, farm workers, etc. All of these tends to be sometimes menial labor, or labor that doesn't have a lot of upward trajectory. This could not be just service, but also unskilled, low-paying work, which lacks autonomy. So we just discussed Anderson, and she's really speaking to, or much of what she's talking about is speaking to these sectors of our economy, areas in which you have no autonomy, no ability to contract about the terms of your employment, and you're really at the behest of whoever's employing you. So these are directed by those who do, for example, laborers on a construction site. So exploitation can be understood as occurring when the amount of labor embodied in any bundle of goods that one could receive in a feasible distribution of society's net product is less than the labor expended. So again, the amount of labor embodied in any bundles of goods that one can receive in a feasible distribution of society's overall product is less than the labor that one has expended. Or alternatively, an unjust distribution is such that the amount of labor embodied in any bundle of goods one could receive is less than the amount of labor that they expended at the cost of another. So the injustices of exploitation cannot be eliminated by just a redistribution of goods, for as long as these institutional practices and structural relations remain unaltered, the process of transfer will recreate the unequal distribution of benefits. So we can't just give certain payments out unless we think of those payments as being constantly recurring. And even so, what you're not going to allow is autonomy in individuals, or produce jobs that enhance status or other social goods that someone might enjoy from their employment. things that are valuable for self-respect, for example. Young actually thinks that marginalization is probably one of the worst kinds of oppressions. Not the worst. She doesn't really put them on a hierarchy, but she thinks this is possibly the most dangerous form, because whole peoples are excluded from work, resulting in severe material deprivation that's not entirely correctable by just simple welfare programs. So marginals are people the system of labor just simply don't use. So old people, young people might be in this category, single mothers, mentally and physically disabled people, persons on reservations, the involuntarily unemployed. These people are roughly in many cases, kept out of the system of labor. And given that our society tends to condition access to welfare programs or even access to social benefits on employment, if you are marginalized out of or if you're considered unemployable, then you actually don't have access to a wide range of social services that would be able to help you. The provision of welfare itself produces new injustices by depriving those dependent on it of rights and freedoms that others have. There's this book that's called Disciplining the Poor. That's a nice history on how the United States has dealt with poverty. Let me see if I can get a picture of it. This book here by some social scientists is particularly insightful and informative for the way that the United States' anti-poverty policies have changed over time to what they consider a disciplining model, and disciplining in the same way that I think they borrow from Foucault's conception of disciplining to construct a particular kind of person. So you can see it's quite an interesting read if you would like to go read it. It's very good. So ultimately, one thing that's really problematic for marginalization is that it blocks opportunities to exercise capacities, like individual capacities, in socially defined and recognized ways that garner respect and notions of value. So one issue with the provision of welfare itself, rational autonomous agents gain full citizenship, so excluding women, the mad, and the poor, and children. So in the history of the way that we think of who gets citizenship, it's usually rational autonomous agents. Historically, this has excluded these categories. The old and the poor and the mentally, physically disabled are subject to patronizing, punitive, demeaning, and arbitrary treatments by bureaucracies. So they're not considered given full citizenship status because they're not fully rational or autonomous. And so then medical and social service professionals take this perspective that they know what's best for those whom depend on those medical and social services. And this dependency itself produces unnecessary conditions of oppression. So she wants to say that the autonomous model of citizenship, this one here, is therefore problematic. We should reject it. Now, even when material standards are satisfied, the development of capacities might be limited, right? So here's on the second point. Participation in social structures and certain processes is blocked, and then there's a consequent deprivation of cultural, practical, institutionalized conditions for exercising those capacities. For her conception of powerlessness, this is fitting. I think it coheres well with some of what we discussed with Anderson. So divisions along class lines generally result in differentiated power relations. So one common one is the distinction between professionals and non-professionals. Non-professionals suffer from a form of oppression in addition to exploitation. So not only are fair goods of the fair value of their labor not fully given to them, they're also not given a particular status that awards them some kind of value in our society. So in a hierarchical business structure, these are the features that we can find. Direct participation in public policy decisions are rare. People do not participate in policies that affect their circumstances. Domination is enacted through widely dispersed powers belonging to just a select few professionals. The powerless are those who lack authority or power in determining the conditions in which they work, so they're dominated in some way. And the powerless can't even develop their skills to become powerful. So in this case, the powerless lack authority, status, and the sense of self that professionals have. Because if you have, instead of not able to participate in policies, you have the empowerment to participate in policies to affect your circumstances, you'll gain a sense of authority. You'll gain a sense of control and a particular kind of status with respect to your peers. Your sense of self will be enhanced. I mean, I think this is one thing that maybe people recognize once they get to college, right? So when you get to decide and be autonomous about what kind of way you want to run your day-to-day life, right? So professionals themselves have more work autonomy and more authority over others. When you get to college, you find that you have less constraints given to you by your professors. So you can control your schedule, you can control your timing, you can dictate when you want to work on something, when you don't. And that actually, I think, is quite liberating compared to the way that you might have been treated in high school. And that just carries on up into professional environments or professional statuses as opposed to non-professional statuses. So those of you that are lucky enough to be in college and to pursue professional careers, you have a very different life than people who are non-professionals and are not cultivating or given an opportunity to cultivate those skills. Being a professional has a very expansive and progressive character. Professionals acquire knowledge and develop expertise, and then they apply it, whereas in a lot of cases, non-professionals are relegated to rather menial tasks that are not really expansive, that don't come with interesting or important avenues for self-exploration and whatnot. So even though I am a worker, in many ways I'm exploited as an adjunct professor, still I retain this kind of professional status. The work that I do, on average, has this kind of expansive and progressive character. I also, as a professor, have some kind of degree of respectability. Individuals treat me with respect, and they listen and follow through with some requests that I make when I indicate that I'm a professor of some sort. So many groups are treated with little respect until it becomes clear that they occupy a position of prestige. So this is probably true of many people who are people of color, or people who are a gender minority, or people who are a sexual orientation minority of some sort. You might be treated with very little respect until it becomes obvious or clear that you are, I don't know, a CEO, or you are a manager, or you are, I don't know, what's a prestigious job, like a financier, or maybe a tech worker or something like that. And then once people hear that you're that, then they treat you very differently. You're treated with much more respect. And one thing that Anderson wants to say here is that this is a degree of respect that's probably due to every citizen. Every citizen deserves some degree of respect and shouldn't be conditional on your association or your identification as a professional person or not. The next category, the second to last, is cultural imperialism. So the idea here is that cultural imperialism means to experience how the dominant meanings of a society render the particular perspective of one's own group invisible at the same time as they stereotype one's group and mark it out as the other. So this can happen by universalization of a dominant group's experience and culture and establishment of that as the norm. So if you look at a lot of like romantic comedies, for example, it tends to be focused around white American folks, usually middle class, maybe upper middle, generally heterosexual relationships. And since all of these, say, romantic comedies are expressed in this way, this is a universalization of really a dominant group's experience and culture. And it's established really as the norm or the expectation. The dominant cultural products of our society then express the experiences, values, goals, and achievements of those groups. So to continue the romantic comedy case, always what's kind of the, the standard story in that is that girl, is kind of lost or fumbling around, and then she meets this guy, and the guy recognizes her for who she is, and then they're able to have some kind of strong relationship. And, maybe the expectation is that they'll get married, have kids, and own a house or something like that. But encounters with other groups challenge this universality, and the dominant group then retaliates by bringing the challenger into its categories and norms. So when something challenges the universality of this particular dominant group, the dominant group will subsume that category into its sets of norms. So this is common in portrayals of homosexual relationships. They tend to, in society, be maybe subsumed into homosexual relationships are just like heterosexual relationships, when in fact they might be very different and uniquely valuable in their own way. That or cultural differences or other differences are going to be perceived as deviations from the norm, right? So the perceived subordinate culture or situ is going to be considered other or radically different or sometimes punished, right? So a lot of times there's this trope in television depictions of homosexuality that if someone is gay or is maybe a gender minority in a certain context, they'll be either killed or punished in some way. So a gay person, at least in traditional, at least the last 20 years or so, depictions of gay relationships, the person's usually punished in some way, either killed or ends up being unhappy or dies of AIDS or something like that. There's usually this bury your gaze. That's what the trope is called, bury your gaze trope. The effects of this on the psychology of someone who has been others, well, it marks one out as deviant or essentialized. They're considered invisible. The differences between them are ignored. So all of the members of the othered group are considered the same, and they go through the same issues and the same problems, whereas the kind of dominant culture is allowed for a wide variety of expressions of characters. So you'll see characters of the other as very monocultural or very much similar. I mean, you'll see this in different depictions of racial categories in the United States media. So a lot of times you'll have Latinx folks being represented as being, I don't know, drug dealers or something. That's a common role for that particular group in our media. During the early 2000s, after 9/11 and into the Iraq War, a lot of depictions of Muslim folks were as terrorists, right? There's a double consciousness as looking at oneself through the eyes of another in a way that disrespects them. So if you're constantly a part of this kind of subordinated or marginalized group and you're looking at media representations of who you are, then it's kind of odd. I mean, I can't speak for every minority perspective, but when you look at the way other people see you in media, it's a very odd sensation to see how the dominant society really looks at you. And in some cases, you might internalize that notion of what they see you as. It might limit your capacities of imagining yourself as something beyond. I know that with the creation of Black Panther, that Marvel film was incredibly important for a lot of Black Americans to see themselves as heroes, as technologically advanced, as sophisticated, in ways that dominant cultural representations of Black Americans really lacked up to that point. While an individual wishes to respect themselves, they might find themselves looking inward from this kind of external perspective. So you don't hear your own culture's voice being represented. And I think those of you that might be part of a privileged class, you might not see how empowering it can be to have a wide variety of options available to you, given just by virtue of the media that you've consumed. So there's usually two cultures in this context when we have cultural imperialism. There's the dominant culture, and that defines an individual according to accepted norms and behaviors. And then there's a subordinate, an individual's own marginalized culture in which the terms of definition vary greatly from the dominant. And those come into play at this point. The final type of oppression that she considered is violence. So there are some groups where the members of them live with the knowledge that they must fear random, unprovoked attacks on their persons or property, which have no motive but to damage, humiliate, or destroy the person. So there's violence from other people. This is institutionalized violence. This is these are rape cases. So, for example, in 1981, over 500 cases of random teenage violence were committed against Black people. And in today's era, so transgender women, particularly transgender women of color, are particularly subject to increasing rates of violence. And this also applies to violence against the gay community and the queer community more broadly, that you can expect that violence can come from just simply you holding hands with your partner in public. That everywhere is kind of a place of threat, or you're in a heightened sense of awareness about who might be leering at you or watching you, or might turn something violent. So why is this violence a problem of, say, injustice or institutional? And she wants to say, look, the social context surrounding cases of violence makes them possible and sometimes even acceptable. So in the United States, for example, let me pull this up. So in the United States, sometimes what happens is a cis hetero man will have sex with a trans woman, and then they find out about the woman's status as a trans person after having sex with them, or maybe they already knew. And then they go and murder that woman. A common defense in those cases to get the person out of a murder charge and squarely into a manslaughter charge is that they will say, I was panicking, my sexual orientation was put into question, and I was being irrational because I was distraught with this panic that I might be gay. So this is called the gay panic defense. What I've shown you here is that as of 2019, the blue states are states that have banned this defense in a court of law. The pink states are states that are considering it, and the gray states are states that have no laws on the books against it. So you can use this gay panic defense in a court of law, no problem. And this defense has actually been quite successful in getting murderers off of the hook for murder and just getting them manslaughter in the case of violence against trans women. So that would be an example of the social context surrounding cases of violence, which makes those cases of violence possible, and in that case at least somewhat acceptable. This violence is a social practice. It's a social practice because everyone knows that it's going to happen and that it will happen again. It's social practice because violators often attack others in a group. So Matthew Shepard's murder was one such case. Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson were arrested and charged and convicted of attacking and murdering Matthew Shepard, a gay male. And that's one example of a case where violators might attack in groups. They're rule-bound, they're social, they're premeditated nature of the violence. That's what makes it a social practice. Individuals tend to be lightly or not punished at all, and that renders this kind of practice acceptable. Continuing on, so that's what it means by social practice. But it's also directed at members of a group simply because they are members of a group, or of that group. So you're attacked simply because you're trans or simply because you're gay. Not only direct violence, but knowledge that one is susceptible to such violence. So I can go out with my wife and we can be knowledgeable and worried that we might be subject to such violence. So that makes it so you have to be careful about how you comport yourselves when you're going in particular places. And ultimately, this deprives the oppressed of dignity and freedom that comes from a sense of security and safety that people of the privileged group widely experience. So this repressive violence is used not simply to assert domination or group privilege, but maybe also out of fear and hatred of said groups. So this is why some advocates suggest that any kind of trans or gay bashing or racism in general, racism in addition, is so problematic is because it stokes fear and hatred, which then can lead to this kind of repressive violence against folk. Because one way to deal with fear and hatred for people is to assert domination or to assert group privilege. So for her to sum, we can apply this criteria. The problem with other social theories on oppression is that they tend to leave out groups that theories think are oppressed, or leave out the ways in which they are oppressed. And this is a problem with defining oppression just according to class, or just according to race, or just according to sex. This fails to accommodate the similarities and the overlaps in the oppression of different groups, so it fails to respect intersectionality. It also falsely represents the situation of all group members as being the same, another element of ignoring intersectionality. So by applying the 5 criteria, we can identify oppression without essentializing or claiming that one is more fundamental than the other. And she thinks that's actually quite nice. That's a good feature of her concept of the 5 faces of oppression. I believe I have cases or examples of the different faces of oppression on the course website, so I highly recommend that you look at some of those other articles and you can see how they map up with these 5 cases.